We have finally reached the time you've all been waiting for, final project time. So now that you've created your RAT CPU and hopefully it's working 100%, you can now design some assembly programs to run on your CPU to do some really cool stuff. So I'm going to introduce you to the files that I gave you to help you start on your final project. So on PolyLearn, I've given you an Etch-a-Sketch folder because my sample project is something very similar to a basic Etch-a-Sketch. Inside that, you'll see 4 subfolders: an assembly folder, a complete ISE project folder, a peripherals folder, and a RAT CPU folder, and then a RAT wrapper VHDL file. Inside the assembly folder, you're going to see 3 assembly programs: DrawDot, W2013, and Etch-a-Sketch. DrawDot is a very simple assembly program that just draws one dot on the VGA screen. W2013 is an assembly program that shows you 3 functions: one function that draws a dot, one that draws a horizontal line, and one that draws a vertical line. And these 2 can be very helpful to help you figure out how to do some simple graphics on the VGA. And then we have the Etch-a-Sketch program, which I will be going through in somewhat detail on this video. Okay, so that's our assembly folder, and also the assembly folder contains the program. So when you open up your RAT sim, you want to open up the file from this assembly folder, so that way when you hit the simulate button or the assemble button, the program for the program that you're assembling will end up in this Etch-a-Sketch assembly folder. Okay, so that's the assembly folder. The peripherals folder has lots of different peripherals that you can use to hook up to your RAT CPU. It has a hardware timer, which was written by Professor Mealy, and you can read about what his hardware timer does in this PDF, and then he's provided the VHDL file, and he also has given a test assembly program for it. Then there's the keyboard, which you can also read about how that keyboard driver works. There's the mouse. Again, it has a README that tells you how to use the mouse. The other has the one-shot module that you're used to from our Interrupt lab, and then it also has a pseudo-random number generator, which was designed by Professor Gerfen. Then we have our 7-segment display, which you're used to, that you've used. We have this ticker, which is just a clock divider. And we have the UART, which is the Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter device. That's your 9-pin port on the Nexus board. If you want to communicate with the computer through that UART, you can do so using this. And I've included a RAT wrapper that shows you how to go about port mapping the UART. And then we have the VGA, which I'm going to talk about, and we have all these files to support the VGA, as well as some information about how it works. Okay, so then we have the RAT CPU folder, and right now I have my RAT CPU files in it, but I've given this to you with a blank. It's empty, and what I want you to do is copy in all of your RAT CPU or VHDL files, so that way you can use it in your project. The complete ISE project folder has the actual project file. Now, mind you, I have version 14.3 of Xilinx on my office computer, and so if you try opening this project file on the lab computers, it might not work. And so if it doesn't work, just create your own project folder. You know, you can do here, create new folder, and create a new folder and create a new project in that folder, and then you can just go ahead and add all of the VHDL files from the other folders that you need. Okay, so that sort of gives you an overview of what's in this Etch-a-Sketch folder. So now let's start talking about the Etch-a-Sketch project. So here in Project Navigator, I have opened up my project, and inside the RAT wrapper, you'll see that I am defining what peripherals I am talking to. So I've got the switches are an input, I have a reset and a clock signal, I have a segment out and a segment enable. This is for the 7-segment display on the Nexus board. I have the LEDs, and I have the PS2D and PS2C signals. This is for data and clock on the PS2, so the PS2 can handle either the mouse or the keyboard input. And then there's 3 VGA output signals, the RGB output signal, and then this HS and VS lines. These are to tell you horizontally and vertically where your RGB value is supposed to be placed. Okay, so in our rat wrapper, we first have defined the port IDs to say, okay, if I'm on port 20, I'm going to be reading from the switches. If I'm on port 93, I'm going to be reading from the VGA. If I'm on port 44, I'm going to be reading from the PS2 keyboard. So far in this example project, I have defined port IDs for the 7-segment display, the VGA, and the keyboard. So as you can see over here on the left, in my project I have my RAT CPU, I have the clock to act as a game clock, which I'll explain. I have the 7-segment driver module, the VGA driver, and the keyboard PS2 driver module, as well as the UCF file. So you're going to see here that I'm going to be port mapping stuff for all of these components. So I define my input port IDs, my output port IDs, then I start declaring the components that I'm using. I have my RAT CPU component, I have my PS2 register component, this is for the keyboard, I have my 7-segment component, which is for the display on the Nexus board, and then I have my VGA driver. I also have my game clock, which is just a clock divider module. So after I declare all my components, I can declare intermediate signals that I need for my port mapping. So these are just declared that I'll be using down in my instantiations for these modules. So I've got some input and output port ID, and load signals, something for the 7-segment display, some intermediate signals for the VGA, some intermediate signals for the keyboard, etc. So now we start port mapping. So here I have my RAT CPU gets port mapped, my game clock or my clock divider is port mapped, my 7 segments port mapped, my VGA is port mapped, and my keyboard is port mapped. So when you're creating your final project, you want to include whatever peripherals, so each of these items, the VGA, the keyboard, the 7-segment, these are all peripherals. So you want to be able to include those components and port map the peripherals that you need. Then you need to add or subtract from the input and output process. So the input process is looking at what's coming in from your peripherals, depending on what your port ID is. So here we see if the port ID is the switches, we're going to grab what's coming in from the switches and put that into the input port, which then goes into the RAT CPU, because as you can see up here, the RAT CPU gets the word input port, which goes into the import of the RAT CPU. So we could have the switches ID, the VGA read ID, or the key code ID, or the PS2 status ID, etc. Now we have another process for our outputs. So this is if the load equals 1, which is when your IOOE signal is a 1. Then your port ID tells you which output you want to go to. So here's our output port from the CPU. It's telling us map that output from the CPU and put it on the LEDs if the port ID is the LED's ID. Here we have the output port is getting mapped to the PS2 control register. If it's the PS2 control ID, we have the output port getting mapped to the 7-segment display, etc. And then you can see here we have 3 for the VGA. We have something for the high address, something for the low address, and something for the write ID. And then we also have this write enable signal saying that if we are writing, we need to activate the VGA write enable. Okay, so this RAT wrapper is just your high-level port mapping of all the different components you want in your system. And like I said, I have a 7-segment, a VGA, and a keyboard in my system. And I've included all of these VHDL files in the project. Okay, so the most important thing now, after you've port mapped what you want to use, is you need to create your program. And your program, as you know, comes from the assembly code. So I'm going to open up the RAT assembler. Let's pull that up here. So I'm going to open it directly from that Etch-a-Sketch assembly directory. I'm going to pull up first my draw dot. No, actually I'm going to pull up the Etch-a-Sketch. Okay, now, so in my Etch-a-Sketch program, what I want to be able to do is use the keys W, A, S, and D to move a little red dot on the screen up, left, down, and right. So every time I hit a W, I want to see a drawing on the screen move in the upwards direction. If I hit the A, I want to go to the left. If I hit the S, I want to go down, etc. So in order to do this, we first need to figure out how actually do you draw anything on the VGA screen. So it's helpful to understand how the VGA driver works. So in order to understand that, let me pull up our Etch-a-Sketch peripherals folder. And here I have the VGA driver info. Okay, so you need to think of your monitor as having 1200 pixels in the frame of 30 pixels as your Y axis and 40 pixels as your X axis. And here in this picture it's showing that if you give an X coordinate of 0 and a Y coordinate of 0, you're going to draw a picture in the upper left hand corner of the display. If you give the coordinate 3929, which is at the, remember this starts at 0, so it goes from 0 to 39 and from 0 to 29. So if you do 3929, you're going to draw a pixel in this lower corner of the screen. Now you also have to know that there is a what's known as a guard, I guess what do they call it? A guard buffer? Guard band. So there's a guard band 24 blocks off to the right of the display. So that means if you actually went to 40, 0, you would be coming into this no man's land over here, which you would not actually see on your display. And so there's actually stuff out here. So if you continue to 40, 41, you're going to be going all the way until this line, and this guard band is 24 pixels long. So that means once you hit 64, you're going to end up back on the left-hand side. So this calculation is explained right here. So the thing is, instead of specifying an X and Y coordinate, you need to give just a single 11-bit address to the VGA display to say which location on the screen do you want to draw to. So this is showing you how you compute the address. If you're at coordinate 0, 0, your address is going to be 0. If you're at address 10, your address is going to be 1. But if you're at address 01, which is on the next line, you're going to be at address 64 for what I just explained, because there's 24 blank pixels over here that run off the end of your screen that you can't see. So this 01 coordinate is actually address 64. Therefore the one next to it is address 65. Then your 20 is going to be the 64 from the first line plus another 64 from the second line, which will give you 128 to get to this next 20 position. Yep, 20 position, 128. So in general, you'll see that the address computation for your block XY is 64 times Y plus X. Okay, so now this brings up some fancy math, which I'm going to show you on my Bamboo tablet in a moment. Also want to make sure you know that not only do you need to know where you want to be placing something on the VGA screen, you also need to know what color you want to put there. So when you send something to the VGA, you need to say where you want to send it and what color you want to send. So here this shows you the format of the color buffer. And it says color information is in the form of a byte, where 3 most significant bits are red, the next 3 are green, and the next 2 are blue. So you could think of it as RRR, GGG, BB. So this means if you want just red, you're going to give it the value 1, 1, 1, and then all zeros. If you want just blue, you're going to give it all zeros and then 2 ones in the blue position. All green is if you make all the greens 1, and then you can mix colors. And also to know that white is when everything is on and black is when everything is off. Okay, so the first thing is this draw dot program. How are we going to actually draw this color to the VGA screen?